Welcome to freedomlovin.com, where we focus on building freedom in an unfree world. Through personal development, location independence, and passive income strategies. Now here's your host, Kevin Koskela.
Welcome to another episode of the Freedom Lovin' Podcast. This is Kevin, and this is episode number 79. And in just a minute, I have an interview with TK Coleman of Praxis, discoverpraxis.com, which is an education company. And we talk about education and real-world philosophy and a lot of other things. Really interesting guest. Stay tuned. It's a long one, but it's definitely worth listening to the full podcast. So just a couple things before we move on to the interview. If you want the highlights of over 100 of the top business books of all time, check out 100mustreads.com. We are now offering a 7-day free trial so you can sample the summaries and absorb as much as possible at no cost. So to get that 7-day free trial, just go to 100mustreads.com and you can sign up right away and you can have access to lots of knowledge, including MP3s and also PDF files. So I'm creating a Freedom Lovin' group on Facebook. I decided to finally do this. I think everybody else that does a podcast seems to have a free Facebook group. So I'm going to start one. It's going to be a closed group. So you have to search for us or friend me, Kevin Koskela, on Freedom Lovin', and then I'll add you to the group. Just make sure you let me know that that's how you found me. It's kind of, groups are really cool. I'm in a few of them on Facebook, specific things that I want to learn more about, and they're really helpful to get resources and chat with people and get into discussions and things like that. So with the Freedom Lovin' group on Facebook, we are going to be covering the topics that we talk about on the show. So how to protect your assets, how to build freedom businesses, where to live, where to travel, lots of these type of topics. I don't have the URL yet, so I'll have to work on that. And lastly, if you like this show, please leave us a rating and review on iTunes. So just click on your little iTunes icon and then go to Freedom Lovin' Podcast and then click on rating and review. It would be awesome, and I will read your review on the next show. So without further ado, here's my interview with TK Coleman. Go out there and build some freedom, and we'll talk to you soon. All right. Well, I'm super excited today to have TK Coleman on the show today. He is the co-founder and educational director of Praxis, which is an education company built around outcomes and not just activities. And their website is discoverpraxis.com. TK, welcome to Freedom Lovin'.
Hey, I'm glad to be here, Kevin. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into, I want to talk about Praxis and what you're doing there and everything, but what is your background? How did you come up with this? How did you get started with this idea of free education? And, where did you come from?
I guess for me, my journey to Praxis began with my relationship with the co-founder, Isaac Morehouse. I've been really close friends with him for more than a decade. We go way back to days on the college campus where we would have late night philosophical discussions about C.S. Lewis and, all other sorts of amazing things. And Isaac had a homeschooling background, so he was always interested in alternative education. And we've always been interested in just the possibilities of being human and being the best version of ourselves. And both of us have always been involved in various creative projects over the years. I've been involved in startup culture for at least about the past decade, and Isaac was the first person I'd always go to bounce ideas off of, and he'd do the same with me. And when he started talking about Praxis a few years ago, he brought it up to me and his brother Levi, and I thought it was a great idea. I was doing a podcast at that time, and I had him come on my podcast, and I interviewed him about it. And I just got so interested in it. I started talking with him about it more. And at that time, he was just calling in favors with different friends to have them help get it running. And so I came in and helped develop the philosophy module for the curriculum library. And I had such a great time just working with him and, building the philosophy module and talking with him about his vision that at one point early on in the process, I said, hey, man, I want in. I want to help you build this thing. I want to be a part of it. I think you're on to something, and I feel passionate about your mission. So we had some conversations about it, and, we haven't looked back. It's funny, too, because although we've been close friends for a really long time, I think I said a decade, but it's been well over 15 years. We've been close friends for such a long time, but we never felt the need to force working together. We never felt the need to come up with some project just so we can have an excuse to work together. But when it came to Praxis, it just seemed like a natural fit. Like it was time for us to do this. So that's how I got involved. But as far as my why is concerned, well, I'm heavily influenced by the philosopher Maxine Greene. And she has a book called Variations on a Blue Guitar. And it's an anthology of lectures that she gave on aesthetic education. And there's one particular lecture where she talks about an initiation into new ways of seeing, hearing, and feeling. And one of the things she says in her opening there is, we are interested in education, not schooling. We are interested in openings, in unexplored possibilities, not in the predictable or the quantifiable, not in what is thought of as social control. For us, education signifies an initiation into new ways of seeing, hearing, feeling, and moving. It signifies the nurture of a special kind of reflectiveness and expressiveness, a reaching out for meanings, a learning to learn. Those are words that I internalized a long time ago, and they continue to resonate with me and capture a great deal of my concept of what it means to educate, what it means to be involved in this process of learning. And so my why I felt so passionate about Isaac's Praxis idea is because I'm passionate about ideas and how those ideas can be used to initiate us into a deeper understanding of our power and the possibilities of what we can create once we tap into that power. And so that's my goal with Praxis. Apart from the specifics of how we do it, my ultimate goal is to help inspire a generation of people who take a non-permission based approach to creativity, to people who take who take the idea seriously, that they have the power to be creative forces and that they don't need to go around hoping to get discovered or waiting for someone to pick them or hoping someone gives them a life in exchange for giving them a sheet of paper or in exchange for doing what they're told. That's what I want to do, and that's why I'm involved with it.
That's so awesome. I love the non-permission based approach. I've never heard that before, but that's a great way of putting it. Now, what was your, when you were in school, what was it like for you? Were you like a really good student, or were you more bored, or what was your feeling at that time going through school?
I learned very early on that if I don't do well in school, I'll get in trouble and create all sorts of difficulties for my life. So although I never particularly enjoyed school, although I refused to give school a whole lot of credit for my educational process. I mean, school didn't teach me how to read. My mother taught me how to read. She taught me how to read using the Bible. So I already knew how to read well before school. And because I've always been so passionate about reading, that would be the primary motivating factor for getting my homework done, so I could actually read and read things that I enjoyed, not things that authority figures told me that I had to read with the threat of being in trouble. So I've always been good enough to avoid getting into trouble. So I've always made it a point to pass my classes and not create any difficulties for myself. But school was just one of those things that for me has always gotten in the way of learning. I've always loved to learn, and I've always loved to read books about things I'm passionate about. And school just always filled my life with a bunch of assignments that would eat up my time and take away from that. And sometimes, unfortunately, I'd spend so much time on schoolwork, and then it'd be time for me to read my books. And my parents would be like, all right, you need to get your head out of books and you need to go outside and you need to go this and that. I'm like, oh man, now I want to do some real reading,
Yeah, just kind of ripping the curiosity out from under you, right?
Absolutely. But hey, I've had some wonderful teachers and I've had some wonderful friends. And I think sometimes when people criticize the flaws in the way we approach schooling, it's misunderstood as, oh, you don't appreciate teachers, or you think teachers are worthless or not very important, or you're neglecting the experiences of people that have had positive moments in school. And I don't overlook or deny any of that at all. I had a lot of positive moments in school. I met a lot of wonderful people there, but that's not an argument for it being the most efficient way to approach education, not by any means.
Right, right. I mean, I think this topic has been done to death on all kinds of podcasts and shows. And if anyone's leaning libertarian, you're going to hear about how horrible the public school system is and all that. But what, in your opinion, is the problem with currently like the compulsory education? And do you think it's fixable, or do you think that we need to have more companies like Praxis out there?
Well, to the latter part, do we need more companies like Praxis out there? Absolutely, yes. But the main problem with education, I would say, is that learning is primarily oriented around something other than what the learner wants to learn. Mm-hmm. If you look at all of the problems that arise in compulsory education, what's the proper way to teach math? Or, why can't we get kids interested in math? Or how do we get them to stay motivated to do this and that? Anytime you're spending so much time, energy, and money figuring out the proper method or technique to get people motivated in learning things, then chances are you're not really paying attention to what their lack of motivation is telling you. Human beings are naturally curious. Human beings are natural learners. And all of these problems arise when we initiate the learning process by starting with what authority figures think you ought to learn. If you look at compulsory education, we don't start with parents and their children. I mean, this would never work in the free market. In the free market, you couldn't ignore your customer. Imagine going to a restaurant and you order a burger and the server tells you, no, I think what you need, is a plate of vegetables, or I think what you need is a grilled cheese. And if you say, well, who's to say that's what I need? Well, that's what the management team decided is a good diet or is good food. I mean, no business would survive in that way. But with compulsory education, we don't start with the parents. We don't start with the students, the actual customers. And I know people hate that word, customer. We're not customers. But we start with bureaucrats, and a small select group of people get to decide what's important based on their personal philosophy. And it has nothing to do with what ought to be the foundation of education, which is asking the learner, what are the results you want to create? What are you interested in? What do you care about? What kind of life do you want to live? What do you want to have? I mean, that's why information matters. It matters to the user and to their ability to apply that information to creating things that matter to them.
Yeah, exactly. No, I get the argument, and of course, I'm sure you've heard this many times. Well, okay, but if we asked the kids what they wanted, they would just say, I just want to play video games all day.
So we can approach that in two ways. The first way is we can say, all right, even if I can see that for the sake of argument, why not ask the parents? Shouldn't the parents have a greater say over how they want their children to be educated, over bureaucrats who don't actually have to live with the consequences of those decisions? I mean, parents are going to be more affected by bureaucrats and school administrators about what their children learn. And parents are almost irresponsibly and disrespectfully ignored and disregarded in this process. I mean, even though homeschooling is certainly a possibility, even then, there's so many hoops that parents have to jump through. It's so hard to be able to have any freedom with how you educate your child that many parents are just incentivized to not even go through the trouble. So that would be the first comeback I'd offer to that. But secondly, I would say, all right, look, children are going to say, I want to play video games all day. And we think they ought to learn these other things because these other things are important. But why are these other things important? These other things are important because at some point in every person's life, they are going to have results they want to create or problems they want to solve, and information is going to be a necessary part of that process. Well, I would contend that one cannot initiate and sustain motivation unless they actually have that sort of problem that makes them care. So for instance, if you look at the empirical evidence, rather than just our ability to generate fear-based scenarios by imagining bad things happening, if you look at the empirical evidence, when children are unschooled or homeschooled, or when children are allowed to follow their interests, what happens is their interests lead to greater interest, because whenever a kid follows his or her interests, they will always run into problems that require them to learn new things. So for instance, if you want to play video games, it's not as if playing video games is a self-explanatory thing. And it's not as if playing video games is fun if you can't do it well. Ask people that actually play video games how fun they are if you can't do them well. When you play video games, you will run across problems problems in technology, problems that demand social intelligence to resolve, problems pertaining to your ability to communicate with others, your ability to strategize. And all of those problems will require you to obtain information and develop new skills. And you will be motivated to do those things because you're not commanded to do them by an authority figure, but you're actually incentivized by your own desires. So I think when you look at people who actually do approach education this way, those fear-based scenarios don't turn out to be a reality. But if the standard is, okay, I can imagine this bad thing happening, and if I can imagine a bad thing happening, then we should treat it as if it's a serious probability. Well, sure, then that person wins the debate. But if you look at the empirical evidence, it's a completely unsubstantiated concern.
Yeah. I mean, I love hearing you say that. And I think that maybe 10 years ago or more, this wasn't really discussed very much. It was kind of like fringe to say things like, oh, children have natural curiosity and they actually want to learn and things like that. I feel like now it's getting more in the mainstream. I just listened to a TED Radio Hour show on education, and it was amazing because they were talking about this teacher over in India that I think he was like a professor, and he basically just went into this like really poor village and he gave them a computer, and these kids didn't know English. They had never seen or heard about computers. They knew nothing. And then he went back like a few weeks later just to see what they were doing, and they were already figuring out, they were teaching themselves English. They were like, they knew how to like even program, write these little programs on it. I mean, they learned so much without anyone guiding them or anyone telling them what to do. And I might play a little clip from that in this show, but I think that backs up your point that it's empirical evidence that is true.
Oh, you know what? I would say go randomly select any parent, just randomly. Go up to a parent and see if you'll find one that will disagree with the following statement, that children up until a certain age are annoyingly curious. Children are annoyingly curious until you school it out of them. You know, they ask so many questions. They want to know why this and why that, and how does this work and how does that work? And there is no parent in the world that has not experienced the temptation to be slightly annoyed or exhausted by this endless array of questions that children just find it so easy to ask. This isn't something that children start doing. This is something that children stop doing. We never have to ask, when do children start being curious? We have to ask, when do they stop being curious? And then the corollary to that question is, why do they stop being curious? I would contend that children stop being curious because very early on, they develop a concept of knowledge that says the most valuable forms of information are those that are deemed to be important by society. And once that becomes people's concept of what it means to be smart, now it requires more discipline than what is natural to the learning process. Now people read and study because it's a dignified, noble, important, responsible, proper thing to do, rather than this wild, insatiable appetite for human knowledge that is more akin to what it really means to be human.
Yeah, exactly. Let's get into Praxis a little bit. What can you get into more specifically? What is your mission and who goes to Praxis? Like what kind of students go there and who you're serving, and just a little more detail on what you're all about.
As far as the mission is concerned, what we want to achieve with Praxis is we want to provide people with an educational experience that helps them identify what's important to them. What do they want to do? What are their priorities? And it's not our job to indoctrinate them with a philosophy about what their priorities ought to be. It's our job to help them clarify their preferences and priorities by deciding what's important to them. So maybe what's important to them is to have a career where they make lots of money and have free time to do other things like be with their family or explore hobbies and so forth. Maybe what's important to them is to have a job that they feel passionate about, to wake up every morning feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm so lucky to be able to do this for a profession. That's important to some people. It's not important to everyone. But what's important to us is that we help people identify what those priorities are, and then we help them translate that into a lifestyle by working with them to set concrete, measurable goals, and then creating strategy maps for them so that they can take steps over the short term to gradually achieve those goals. How we go about doing that? Well, we have a two-pronged system where our participants spend, on average, 30 hours a week working with a business partner and we have over 100 different business partners in our network. And the participant works with a business based on a variety of different factors. What are their interests? What kind of industry do they want to work in, whether they know that or not? What kinds of skills and attributes they want to develop, what their geographical preferences and restrictions are, and so forth. So they go work for 10 months, 30 hours a week. And something that I talk about a lot, one of the agreements we have with our business partners is that no more than 50% of the workload can consist of administrative tasks, because we don't want our participants just being paid to take up space or being occupied with busy work or just doing traditional intern work. We want a full-scaled apprenticeship and a mentorship. We want them to have a wide range of knowledge concerning what it takes to run that business, to manage the day-to-day affairs of that business. We want them to understand the different ins and outs, the different departments. We don't want them to see some aspects of the work as being beneath them and other aspects as being above them. We want them to develop the kinds of skills that are going to give them more than the right to say, hey, I ran through the motions, did what I was told, and completed this program. We want them to complete the program with confidence that can be backed by experience, a confidence that comes from knowing that they actually created value for this business, that they did meaningful work, and that they learned things from people who do the work. So that's part of the program. Then the other part of the program, the educational experience, it consists of a series of professional development projects that our participants do every month. So a professional development project is any activity or set of activities that you commit to doing every day for a period of time that are designed to help you master new skills or areas of interest, become a better version of yourself, and become more valuable to the marketplace. For Praxis, we do our professional development projects every 30 days. So each PDP is a 30-day PDP, and it's influenced by three elements. Number one, what does the participant want to learn based on their interest and their goals? Number two, what attributes or skills does their business partner want them to develop in order to create more value for the company where they're working? And number three, what are some blind spots, weaknesses that we see as a Praxis staff that they could work on in order to help them achieve their goals more efficiently? So every month they meet with their Praxis advisor, they go over their goals, we create a strategy map for them, we identify a few activities that they're going to do. They do it every day for that month. They document and track what they're learning and how they're growing and what they're creating on their blogs. And at the end of every month, there has to be a deliverable. They have to create something that signals their ability to take what they've learned and use it in a practical way. This is a very important aspect to the way we approach education, because in conventional education, the way you demonstrate knowledge is by taking a test. And my contention is, apart from being interrogated by the police, there's really no context in the real world where you're ever required to demonstrate what you know by answering questions from an authority figure in order to prove you're not lying about what you said you did and where you said you were. In the real world, the way you demonstrate knowledge is you signal your ability to create value by actually producing services or goods. You have to use that information to entertain people, to enlighten people, or to do those very things for yourself. So we always challenge our participants to demonstrate what they've learned by doing those kinds of things. Create a project, record a podcast episode, get an article published in a third-party blog, things along those lines. So that's something of a glimpse to how we go about it. In addition to that, all of our participants have weekly coaching sessions with their Praxis advisor. We function like a life coach and a job coach. We help hold them accountable to their goals. We challenge them to think critically about the things they want. And, we help them just navigate the creative challenges that arise in the workplace, all sorts of things. That's somewhat of a glimpse.
It basically sounds like the opposite of my college education, which was not at all practical. But so what types of people are go in Praxis? Like, what are your clients? Do you call them clients or students? Or
we call them participants.
Okay. Yeah. So are they out of high school? Are they out of college? Or what's the kind of typical student? Or
as far as the education background of our participants, we have a few different kinds. We have some participants who have recently graduated college, usually a year or two removed from having graduated, and they would like to do Praxis sometimes as a way to help facilitate their transition into the real world, or sometimes to gain valuable experience before going on to grad school, or sometimes just because things have changed since graduating college, or they knew they wanted to do Praxis before graduating, but they were so close, they wanted to finish it first. We have other participants who we call them college opt-outs. They're people who are struck by our vision. They're really excited about doing the program. They're not interested in doing college at all. They see the opportunity cost is too high, or they want a more direct path to what they want to do, and they choose Praxis as an alternative to college. And then we have other participants who are in college and they use Praxis as a gap year program where they just take a year off and they do this in order to gain a competitive edge that many of their college peers don't have. As far as our official stance on that is concerned, for us, we don't place a college or non-college requirement on people applying to Praxis. If it doesn't matter to us if someone is in college, they haven't done it, or if they've already completed it. What matters to us is that the person is self-motivated. They have an entrepreneurial mindset, whether they want to start a business or not. And they're ready to think beyond the status quo, and they're ready to approach their professional life creatively.
Really cool. And are people kind of scattered all over the world, or is it mostly centered in the U.S., or how do you work that?
So right now we're centered in the U.S. Our participants live where they work. So we have different participants in various parts of the states. And we do have a sense of community, though, because we meet quite regularly for group discussions and one-on-one discussions, but we make use of technologies like Zoom and Skype and Google Hangout to do all of that stuff. We also have a private Facebook group where we have pretty regular interactions and brainstorm sessions. We share resources and so forth. But as far as where they live where their business partner is. So there is no one place that all Praxis participants stay.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm. Can I add one thing actually to part of when we look at careers, I think traditionally there are two ways that one can approach a career. Actually, I would say traditionally, there's one way in which it's mainly been approached. You can approach your career scientifically. You can approach it artistically. The dominant paradigm is to approach career scientifically. When you look at the way science works, there's definitely a human element for sure, because we have to communicate our theories. But the fundamental approach is we begin with the supposition that there are things to be known or discovered in the external world. And when we talk about things like gravity or thermodynamics or electromagnetism, we're not talking about things that we've made up. We may have made up the words that we use to describe these things, but we're talking about objective facts. When people in a debate say, that's a scientific fact, they say that with such authority because they believe themselves to be talking about something that is independently verifiable. It's not something that I made up or that you made up or that can be modified with our preferences. It is a fact, and we have discovered that fact. This is the way most people have been conditioned to approach their careers. They consult authority figures, or they look at statistics that say, well, here's what you'll make if you have this major, or here's what you'll make if you go into this field. And they approach it scientifically, like their place in this world is something for them to discover based on facts that exist independently of them that they themselves do not have the power to change. Mm-hmm. The artistic approach is entirely different. If you talk to someone like Jay-Z and you ask him about his process of writing a song, you'll find that his dominant approach is to make it up. Now, he may draw from pre-existing elements. I mean, he didn't create the piano. He didn't create the music studio where he does the recording, or he may sample someone else's music and make it a part of his hook. But ultimately, the bulk of what he's producing is something that he made up. And this is something that conventional education doesn't teach us how to do. But in adult life, something that we find out is that the answers that are most worth having are the ones that we have to make up. And by make up, I don't mean fabricate or deceive ourselves into thinking something is true when we know it's not. But by make up, I mean we draw forth from our creative ability to invent things that did not exist before we got here. We take our ability to do that seriously. And I would contend that that's not only a competitive advantage in the professional world, but Our world is very different from the world of our parents and our grandparents. I would contend that even if once upon a time we did live in a world where it was possible to succeed through the scientific approach, that is becoming less and less true for the majority of us. And I believe that not only in the future, but in a future that has begun already and is beginning to expand more and more, it is going to be more and more difficult for people to survive if they don't learn how to approach their careers artistically, if they don't learn how to depend on themselves and their ability to make up the answers and make up the opportunities they need.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, it's like I do a lot of internet marketing. I do business online, and every day I have to do, it's different. It's not, there's no formula. There's no set thing. Like everything changes so fast and you have to adapt. And so I find that is absolutely true. And it's getting, like you said, it's getting more like that with every career where you have to be creative. I mean, it isn't like 40, 50 years ago where you just get out of school and you've got a job and you work there for 40 years and then you retire. It's like, it's a completely different world. And I think that's why I just admire what you guys are doing there. And I'm also curious, you're obviously a thinker and you've got some amazing blog posts, and I'll link to your blog in the show notes here, but you teach philosophy there at Praxis. And I'm curious how, because I mean, I like the way you think and the way you think about problems and the way you obviously teach it. What kind of philosophy are you teaching? Like, how do you teach people to think about these things?
Right. So one of my old philosophy professors was fond of saying, critical thinking isn't taught, it's caught. Now, for all of my philosophical friends who might be listening and who feel inclined to say, well, that's not technically true or precise, whatever, I would invite them to be gentle, to proceed charitably, and to simply ask themselves, okay, what was probably meant by that? What's the good intention that was conveyed? And I think the good intention that was conveyed is that more important than indoctrinating people with any specific piece of content or with any specific ideology is stimulating their capacity to analyze arguments, to identify and question assumptions, and to observe the same phenomena from multiple points of view. And I would say the way we approach philosophy, we emphasize that more than anything else. And really, that's what the aim and essence of philosophy is. And every good philosopher I've known, whether that was a professor or a friend, has approached philosophy that way. That doesn't mean we have to be relativists and deny the existence of certain axioms or objective truths or pretend that facts don't exist at all. But it doesn't matter what the facts are if we don't develop our capacity to think critically and creatively about those facts. So what we do in the Praxis program is we do a few different things. Number one, we actually do have a module with tons of content where they study the history of philosophy. So they do take a look at some of the great thinkers throughout the ages that have contributed to some of the questions and problems that have existed over the years. And the goal there isn't to memorize names and dates, but to develop a context for the kinds of questions that were asked and why those questions were important to certain people. I often say that to be ignorant of history is not to be uninfluenced by it. So we're all influenced by history, and to know a bit about history can help contextualize your own struggles, your own problems, and your own questions. So we do take a look at those things. We take a look at a lot of the basics of critical reasoning, the structure of arguments, understanding fallacies, and knowing how to identify those sorts of things, you know, even understanding our own cognitive biases. We take a look at, so for instance, Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy, where he covers a variety of different philosophical perplexities that have existed over the years. You know, we may take a look at something like David Hume's problem of induction, or we may even take a look at, something like the ontological argument for the existence of God. And the purpose here isn't to convince anyone that God does or does not exist, nor is it to convince anyone that Hume was right or wrong about induction or to even resolve it. But the purpose is to help participants familiarize themselves with the process of wrestling with questions that don't have easy answers. I once taught a philosophy course. I was a TA for an intro to philosophy course. And one of the things I noticed, it was a class of freshmen at the college I attended. And whenever we talked about any philosophical question, by the end of class, the entire class was just so restless, and they would say, okay, what's the answer? What's the answer? You know? And I think that tension is something that we haven't been taught how to deal with in conventional schooling. And I think it's very, very important that we learn how to be, I don't want to use the word comfortable, but rather that we learn how to feel at home in the tension and cognitive dissonance of wrestling with questions that don't have easy answers, or that don't have answers that you're going to get overnight or the next week. Because in life, the kinds of problems that we have in the real world are often the kinds of problems that may not have any answers, or if they do have answers, you're not just going to get them by asking an authority figure, you know?
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting, because I remember in college, hearing about, I think I took like 2 philosophy classes, and I had the opinion that, what does this stuff matter? Like, why am I taking this? It has no relevance to anything. It's not practical. But it sounds like, from what you're saying, you're teaching like more of a practical, this is how it's going to really actually help you in life. And I had to laugh when you said teaching about like logical fallacies and things like that, because if anyone's ever been on an argument on the internet, you will see that tactic used all the time, where it's just complete logical fallacies and ad hominem attacks and all that. And it's funny because that just shows you like how little education people have in philosophy out there and how badly it's needed.
Oh my gosh, you see it all the time. I mean, all you have to do is watch any political debate that has ever been televised, and you'll see a litany of ad hominem attacks where people discredit an individual's claims based on some aspect of their personality or personal history, even though nothing could be clearer than the fact that truth, by its very nature, exists independently of the attributes of those who espouse it. You know, the proposition that 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't magically become false just because a thief says it, or just because a murderer says it. And the ability to make those distinctions is crucial. But let's go back to a question you posed. You said once upon a time you would ask, why does philosophy matter? Well, to ask that question makes a number of presuppositions. Number one, you're making the presupposition that there are some things in life that matter and are worthy of our time and energy, and there are other things that don't. The things that do matter can be distinguished from the things that don't matter by reason and argumentation. Furthermore, you're also assuming that there is some sort of criterion that can be used to distinguish a good argument from a bad argument, so that we can know when someone is trying to BS us versus when someone is providing compelling evidence. And when you say, why does philosophy matter? You're also expressing a conviction that says, I refuse to devote my life energy to anything that cannot be substantiated by evidence, or that cannot prove itself to be worthy of my time. The very act of questioning philosophy in that way is itself the essence of what it means to do philosophy. But the reason the question arises is because most of what we learn prior to philosophy is science, where we focus more on the memorization of facts or the pragmatic application of facts. So people tell us what the facts are, and then they tell us how to use them. And philosophy doesn't really have a large body of knowledge to offer, at least in the same way that science does. But the value of philosophy doesn't lie so much in the body of knowledge it has to offer, but rather in the way it challenges us to think about knowledge.
Yeah, that's some deep stuff, but it's so true, and it's so lacking out there that it gets frustrating sometimes to have some knowledge of philosophy and go out there and interact with people and realize that most people have no philosophy. It's not that they're wrong or that they studied something that was different than what I studied, but it's that they just don't have anything with philosophy. It's sort of like they just absorbed all the information that was given to them, and that's it. And there's no questioning it, and just move along.
Absolutely. And it's tragic because everyone cares about evidence. Now, when we decide to care about evidence, it kind of depends. Are you criticizing people in my camp, or are we criticizing people in the other camp? You know, right. Are you criticizing my political party, or are you criticizing someone else's political party? So even though we might pick and choose when we care about evidence, people care about evidence. But one of the interesting things about evidence is that most people have never thought about what their concept of evidence is and if it's reasonable and if it's fair. So people are quick to say, where's the evidence for that? Or prove this or that to me. But if you were to ask someone, all right, what kind of proof would satisfy you? What sort of evidence could I offer you for this claim that you would find convincing? And once you tell me what that standard is, let's see if I can apply that standard to the things you already believe and if it holds up. And if it doesn't, let's ask ourselves, is that standard reasonable or fair? Is it even consistent with things you already believe? Are there assumptions your standard is based on that we ought to question or subject to scrutiny? Most people have not had that conversation with themselves about evidence, but we're quick to demand it. Give me evidence, prove this or that. But when you actually have the conversation about what you think good evidence is, you find that there may be all sorts of flawed assumptions in that as well. And the goal, of course, isn't to go around using philosophy to be a jerk who picks on people. You don't know what you're talking about. You're an idiot. I mean, it's not about being an arrogant snob. I mean, I look at philosophy as something that exists for me to clarify my own thinking so that I can be a better person, and I try to encourage others to use it in the same way.
Yeah, exactly. So to switch gears a little bit, but along these lines of philosophy, I ask this to a lot of my guests. How do you define freedom?
How do you define freedom? Oh my gosh. So it's challenging because politically we can define it one way. And then I think there may be what I would call a spiritual notion of freedom. So right. I would say I define political freedom as a society in which individual rights take precedent over central planning, any form of central planning. A free society is when individuals get to decide for themselves what their priorities are, what their choices are, how they live their lives, and no one gets to use force as a means of imposing on anyone else's freedom to do the same. That's what a free society means to me. Philosophically or spiritually, what does it mean to be free? I would say what it means to be free is to live with the conviction that your happiness, your fulfillment, your pursuit of a meaningful life is up to you, the thoughts you think, and the choices you make.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think there's a lot of different aspects to freedom. That's kind of why I started this podcast. I like to get into like a lot of different things, like whether it's political or just, how you set up your life, like personally, or like you said, spiritually. Like there's so many different elements to it.
I'll tell you what interests me most about freedom.
Sure.
Political freedom, I don't want to dismiss the importance of that. And I state that explicitly because once you start talking about psychological freedom, it's easy for people to interpret what you're saying as if you're denying or neglecting the importance of political freedom. So I want to get that out of the way. But in terms of what interests me the most is the concept of how to be free or how to live freely, in spite of the fact that you exist in a world that is in so many ways unfree. Because no matter what your political philosophy, no matter where you live, there are going to be aspects of life that you don't like and that you can't do anything about. There are going to be unfair things that happen to you or that affect you and the people you love. There are going to be various forms of injustice. There are going to be political issues. And while it might have value to engage in political activity to fight against those things or change those things, it's not as if we can afford to wait until the world is perfect and all political wrongs have been righted before we can engage in the pursuit of happiness or in the pursuit of fulfillment. So for instance, right now it's the election period and everybody is in a big huff about Donald Trump or Ben Carson or Republican or Democrat. And the fact of the matter is, no matter who gets elected, the overwhelming majority of people in this country are still going to have a set of problems that aren't going to go away because of who the president is. Mm-hmm. If you don't get along with your spouse now, Donald Trump and Ben Carson cannot save you. Bernie Sanders cannot save you. If you can't look in the mirror with a clear conscience now about the way you conduct your life, then no Republican or Democrat can save you. And so once we're all done with that, we're going to have to go back to our lives. And we're going to have to deal with the everyday challenges that confront us in our own hearts and in our own minds in our efforts to be free. And that's the concept of freedom that I enjoy talking about the most, and I enjoy helping people find the most. Learning how to live the best life you can and learning how to create the results that matter most to you in spite of all the BS and injustice and wrongdoing and crappy stuff that exists in the world. I think that is one of the greatest expressions of human power and one of the greatest causes that one can ever be involved in.
Yeah, man, you're totally speaking my language. The book, How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World by Harry Brown, have you read that?
Absolutely. It's had a big impact on my life.
Nice, nice. Yeah, that's something I mentioned quite a bit here. And then you had a quote that actually ties in exactly with what you're saying. You said, "We can create a better world whether politicians listen to us or not." And I think that just ties right into what you were saying about doing it yourself, not waiting for some politician to come around and make things better, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you look at the way social change works throughout history, you'll find that political force is more of an effect rather than a cause of change. Now, you have to look behind the rhetoric because politicians are very good at positioning themselves at the center of any movement or any revolution, especially when they find out that it's politically profitable for them to do this, and making it appear as if they were the leader, as if they were the initiating force of this great change. But if you look at all of the significant changes that have happened throughout our nation's history, even if those changes are ultimately crowned by political activity, the bulk of the work was done by ordinary people, by people like you and I, by people who are not politicians. And, so one of my favorites is the story of Rosa Parks. I have a picture of Rosa Parks sitting across my desk. I look at it every day. She's one of my biggest heroes. Rosa Parks was involved with a lot of political activity, but her greatest impact, her great legacy, and she wasn't just an ordinary woman who didn't know anything about politics and who wasn't socially involved, trying every day to help bring about change. But on this particular day, according to Rosa's own words, she was tired. She was sitting on the bus, man, and she was tired. This was the wrong person on the wrong day to say, you got to get up and go to the back of the bus or we're going to call the police. And she refused to comply. And when she refused to comply and she was arrested, what happened? It wasn't as if a politician stepped up, an elected official stepped up and said, this is wrong, get Rosa Parks out of jail. No, politicians are smarter than that. They need to wait and see what the people think first, because they can't get what they want unless they know enough people are going to back them. So what happened next? Well, ordinary people decided to express their angst through protest and by putting their money where their mouth was. People stopped taking the bus. People started walking miles and miles to their jobs, suffering the inconvenience of not feeding into a bus system that didn't acknowledge them. There were many drivers and people of different races who decided to chip in and help people carpool and give people rides. And only after that process built enough momentum did politicians get involved and decide, okay, we have to acknowledge this. We have to change things politically because the people won't accept anything else. So whenever you see political change happen, it's because the politicians who are involved in that change can no longer afford to ignore or neglect or dismiss what it was previously profitable for them to ignore or neglect or dismiss.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's really good points there. Now, so there was something I read on your blog, and you went through. There was you personally, TK, went through some sort of incident with the police in LA, I believe. And I loved reading your blog post like right after that because you had so many takeaways from it that were actually positive. And I would have been like, if I put myself in that position, I would have been so angered and furious and, we got to get those guys. But you had some different takes on it. And the quote that you said was, being empathetic towards those who feel doubt or discomfort when we announce our plans is the mark of a mature mind. So that I think you were talking about, kind of people that do things a little bit differently. But I wanted to also get into a little bit of reactions to events and reactions to other people and how you go about that.
Sure, absolutely. Well, so first, there's one big misunderstanding about the way I handle that experience that I want to clear up. I think people read my story and they assume that I'm some Zen-like figure who has an amazing amount of self-control and is just this Buddha-like guy who, no matter how much you push him, is incapable of losing his cool. That's not the case at all. And in fact, in that situation, my wife and I both acted out of self-interest. Whether I have self-control or not, I'm not stupid. And I know when someone is in a position to harm me and when I am not in a position to harm them. So there's a zone that you don't go into out of your own self-interest if you're in a position where you know that you can be threatened if you go into that zone. So the self-control that I exercised in that moment wasn't so much about me radiating the energy of love and light in some new age sense. It was about me doing the best that I could do to make sure that me and my family were safe and that we got through that experience without any additional trouble. That's the first thing. Secondly, in terms of being angry.
Sorry, TK.
Please.
Do you want to explain what happened? Or
Sure. So it's a post I wrote on Facebook, and then Fee picked it up. But basically, it was an experience that transpired about 3 years ago, where my wife and I, we had this Friday night routine where we would go to, comedy clubs. It's just one of the things that we like to do. And one night we were going out to the comedy club, and we were driving down a particular street here in the South Bay, and we were pulled over. And one of the officers came up to the car, and the question that he asked me is, do I have legit ID? I said yes, but he didn't ask me to see said legit ID. He told me to get out of the car. And from that point on, a nightmare of an experience happened. The experience could have been worse, but it was certainly bad enough. And, what proceeded was I ended up being put in handcuffs, and I ended up being put in the back of the squad car. My wife and I were detained for a long amount of time. They spent a lot of time questioning her very aggressively, and they ended up searching our car. They dumped out her purse. And, it was just a humiliating experience. It was a very frustrating, troubling experience. They were very disrespectful. It wasn't fun at all. They detained us for so long that we missed our show. But fortunately, they let us go. There was no explanation given. There were no charges made. And, there are a lot of people who, I won't say a lot, but there are a few people who have accused me of making up this story for attention. But I think anybody who knows my life, anybody who knows me personally, or anybody who not only reads my story, but watches what I actually do in the real world and contrast that with what I don't do, would see that I would be the worst guy in the world to make up this story, because there's nothing I could possibly gain from it in any sense of career, because this is not a topic that I enjoy talking about or that I ever hope to make a career out of. But it's something that my wife and I experienced, and it was a tough, challenging thing. But, so connecting this to what you talked about with anger, I actually was very angry, and I actually did want with all of my heart to take those two guys down. And if I had the power to exact revenge upon them in any way, I surely in that moment would have taken advantage of such power. So I certainly was not in a Zen-like state. I certainly wanted to get them for it. But at the same time, I was powerless to do anything about it because of the nature of the situation. Like I mentioned in the story, I didn't obtain the necessary data for incriminating them. I don't even know, as far as I still know, you have to be able to look at the side of a police car to know what town it's from. I don't even know what town it was that pulled me over. I know exactly where I was. I know the intersection and everything. I know exactly where I was. But, I don't know who it was that pulled me over. And the next day, I talked with someone about it from the police department in my neighborhood and also in another neighborhood. And they addressed some of my concerns. Both of those officers were very respectful. They gave me some information that was pretty valuable and whatnot. But I did want to do something about it. But one of the reasons why I told my story, because a question that came up quite a bit was, hey, if this happened 3 years ago, if you don't know who the officers were and you can't incriminate them, why would you even bother talking about it? And I think that question evinces a lack of political imagination. I think it's rooted in an understanding of reality that says the only way or the best way to have a real impact on social change is to be able to do something about it politically. But I like to invoke the words from the famous saying, the pen is mightier than the sword. I realized that even though I couldn't do anything about those two officers in particular, I could still have a positive impact on my social network by telling my story and being an example for those who have experienced similar forms of abuse, whether it's come from police officers or anyone else, and help give them the courage to share their stories, perhaps bring healing not only to my own life, but to the lives of others who have gone through these sorts of things, and to try to be an example that says, hey, here's something negative that happened, but you know what? I'm not going to become a jerk because of this. I'm not going to turn into someone that hates everyone because of this. I'm not going to become a racist because of this. I'm not going to adopt a convenient political ideology because of this. I'm not going to let this steal my fire. I'm going to remain a motivated person. I'm going to remain an inspired person, and I'm going to remain committed to making the world a better place, regardless of what happened to me. So that's what motivated me to write the story. And I believe I made the impact that I wanted to have in that way, in spite of the price that I paid for it. I'll take that price any day in exchange for the opportunity to inspire one person.
Yeah, that is so awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's a tough thing to go through. I've never been through anything like that, but definitely had some experiences with like border patrol and things like that, which are not so pleasant. And you just feel kind of powerless and hopeless. And it's like, I love that you took it and you're making it into an example of something like, this is how I reacted. And maybe people can learn from it and benefit from it and change how they look at situations and improve their own lives instead of taking out, anger on other people or putting blame on something that's kind of external outside of their control. So that's
absolutely. And you know what? And that's not to say there are no political conversations that can be had. I think there are both political and social changes we can make that would mitigate the odds of these kinds of experiences happening. I think there are changes that everyone can make that can help contribute to that. So I'm not saying anyone who's having that conversation is wasting their time. But what I am saying is, while people have that conversation, we still need to live our lives. And it's important that we have a philosophy of life that empowers us to do that to the best of our ability.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. Well, hey, we've been on for almost an hour, which is amazing. I've really enjoyed this conversation with you, TK, but I think we'll just wrap it up here. Do you have anything else to add before we sign off here?
Oh, my. Well, I guess since the last thing we talked about was that incident, I did an interview with Isaac Morehouse a few years ago for a Laissez-Faire magazine where I told a much briefer, summarized version of that story. But the goal of that interview was to talk about my life philosophy in general. And so the story was just a part of that context. But one of the things I told him was my big takeaway from that story, from that experience, is don't let anyone steal your fire. This world is filled with all sorts of people. Some people are jerks. Some people are evil. Some people are rude. Some people are racist. Some people are sexist. Some people will hate you for reasons that are not good. And while we don't need to pretend as if everything is okay, we do need to make sure that we don't allow those people to corrupt or contaminate our ability to have a positive impact on the world. Each of us can contribute to the existence of a freer planet if we stay focused on what we can do to make the world a better place. And we give more attention to that than to what some jerk is doing to fight against that. So I would say stay focused and don't let anybody out there steal your fire, no matter how much of a threat to freedom you think they are. You always have more power if you just stay focused.
I wish that I could go back in time and be like in college and be able to join Praxis and, start at an earlier age. But I just, I love what you guys are doing. Keep it up. And again, the website is discoverpraxis.com. And TK, your blog is at tkcoleman.com.
You got it, man.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much for coming on and sharing all your valuable information here. Love to keep in touch and good luck with everything.
Hey, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Freedom Lovin' Podcast. To break free today, head on over to freedomlovin.com and download our free guide. 7 practical tips to living free in an unfree world.